I stood in my own kitchen on the morning of my granddaughter's 7th birthday, holding a pink frosted cake I had spent 3 hours making from scratch. And my daughter in law looked me dead in the eye and said, "We don't need you there, Connie. You make everything about yourself." She didn't whisper it. She said it like it was nothing, like I was nothing. I set the cake down on the counter very carefully. I didn't trust my hands. My son was standing right behind her. He looked at the floor. I drove home alone that afternoon. I didn't cry until I pulled into my driveway. And then I sat in the car for a long time, thinking about all the ways I had tried, all the years I had shown up, all the times I had bitten my tongue so hard I could taste blood. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning. My name's Connie. I'm 63 years old. I live in a small house in Raleigh, North Carolina, the same house my husband Harold and I bought the year our son was born. Harold passed 6 years ago. No, I won't go down that road. He passed 6 years ago, and after the grief settled into something I could carry, I found my footing again. I kept the house. I kept his vegetable garden in the backyard. I kept the tradition of Sunday dinners, even when it was just me eating alone at a table set for four. I have two children. My daughter Bette lives in Portland with her husband and their two kids, and I see her whenever I can, which is never often enough, but always warm when it happens. And then there's my son. My son Joel is 36. He works in commercial real estate. He's smart and ambitious, and when he was a little boy, he used to climb into my lap even when he was too big for it and ask me to read him the same 3 books every single night. I memorized those books. I still remember the words. He met Melissa when they were both 31. She was sharp and pretty and confident in a way I immediately respected. I told Joel on their third date, he called me after, like he always did back then. I told him she seemed like someone who knew exactly who she was. I meant it as a compliment. I should have paid more attention to what that actually meant. Melissa came from money. Not old money, but the kind of new money that becomes its own identity, where your worth is measured in square footage in the right preschool and whether your kitchen counters are quartz or marble. She wasn't cruel at first. She was just particular about everything, about how the holidays were run, about where they vacationed, about which pediatrician the girls should see. They had two daughters, Rosie and June. Rosie was 7, June was 4, and I loved them so completely it sometimes scared me. That's the thing nobody tells you about grandchildren. It's a different kind of love than the love you have for your own children. It's almost helpless. You look at this small person and you think, I would burn the world down for you. And also, I have absolutely no power here. I learned that second part slowly. The first time Melissa made it clear I was not part of their inner circle, I told myself it was just her personality. We were at Rosie's 5th birthday party, a proper party, at a rented venue with a photo booth and a dessert table and goodie bags that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. I arrived with a gift and offered to help set up. Melissa handed me a name tag, like I was one of the other parents, and pointed me toward the seating chart. I was seated at the far end of the room, at a table with the neighbors' kids' nannies. I smiled the entire afternoon. I sang happy birthday so loud, Joel laughed across the room. I hugged Rosie until she giggled and squirmed away. I drove home and I told myself it didn't mean anything. But it did mean something. It meant I was being managed. Over the next year and a half, the managing got more organized. Melissa started scheduling my visits, 2 hours on Sunday afternoons, once every 2 weeks. Not as a conversation, as a calendar invite, sent to my email with a subject line that said Grandma Visit. Like a dentist appointment, like something to be scheduled and contained and then checked off. I said yes, every time, because what was I going to do? Fight with my son's wife about calendar invites and lose access to my granddaughters entirely? So I smiled, and I showed up on Sunday afternoons, and I read books and played dolls and braided June's hair, and made the most of every minute I was given. Joel called less. When we did talk, the conversations were shorter. He always sounded like he was in a hurry, or like someone might walk into the room. I noticed. I filed it away. It was Harold's life insurance that changed everything. Harold had been meticulous about our finances. It was one of the things I loved most about him, that quiet, steady carefulness. When he died, he left me in good shape. The house was paid off. There was a retirement account, some savings, and a life insurance policy that I had honestly forgotten the full amount of until the check arrived. I talked to a financial advisor. I talked to my attorney. And then I sat at Harold's old desk in the study. I'd never moved his things, not really, and I decided what I wanted to do with the money. I set up education funds for both girls. I went through a proper trust structure with a trustee, my attorney, and specific conditions. The funds would be available for higher education or vocational training when each girl turned 18. Neither Joel nor Melissa could access the principal before then. That was not an accident. I knew what I was doing. I told Joel about it over the phone. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Mom, that's incredibly generous. The girls are going to—" And then I heard Melissa's voice in the background, low and pointed, and Joel said, "Actually, can I call you back?" He didn't call back that day. 3 days later, Melissa called me herself. She was very polite, very measured. She said she appreciated the thought, but that they preferred to manage the girls' finances themselves, and that it might be better if I channeled that generosity into something more immediate, like helping with their private school tuition. I said I'd think about it. I did not think about it. I already knew my answer. The next few months were the strangest kind of quiet. Melissa didn't bring up the funds again. My Sunday visits continued on schedule. Rosie drew me a picture of us holding hands with "I love you, Grandma Connie" spelled mostly correctly at the bottom, and I had it framed and hung it in my kitchen where I could see it every morning. Then in March, my attorney called me. He told me that someone had contacted the trust administrator requesting information about the fund balances and the conditions for early withdrawal. The request had not come from him. It had come from a financial advisor, someone I didn't know, at a firm I'd never heard of. I asked if it had been authorized. He said no, and that they had declined to share any information, and that I should be aware. I sat with that phone call for a long time. I thought about Melissa's voice, very polite, very measured, suggesting I redirect my generosity toward tuition. I thought about the way Joel went quiet when she walked into a room. I thought about the calendar invites and the name tag at the birthday party and 6 years of biting my tongue. I called my attorney back, and I made some changes to the trust structure, additional protections, additional documentation, everything above board, everything legal. And then I called my son. Joel came over on a Tuesday evening without Melissa. That itself told me something. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework and celebrated his college acceptance and told him his father was sick. He held his coffee mug with both hands and wouldn't quite look at me. I told him what my attorney had told me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. He said he didn't know anything about it. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I said, "Joel, I need you to hear me. I set up those funds for your daughters because I love them and I wanted to give them something your father would have wanted to give them. Not for you and Melissa to manage, for Rosie and June when they're old enough to use it themselves." He said, "I know that, Mom." I said, "Does she?" He was quiet again. Then he said, "Things have just been stressful. The mortgage on the new house is a lot, and Melissa's been worried about Joel." I kept my voice very even. "I am not a bank." He flinched. I have never said anything like that to him before. I had spent 36 years making sure he felt provided for and loved, and never once made him feel like a burden. And now I was sitting across from him telling him I was not a bank, and it hurt both of us, and it needed to be said. He left that night without us resolving anything. He hugged me at the door. He always hugged me, even now. And I held on a second longer than usual because he was still my boy, and none of this changed that. The birthday cake incident happened 6 weeks later. I had asked, well in advance, if I could be there for Rosie's 7th birthday. Not host it, not plan it, not interfere with whatever venue or theme or dessert table Melissa had organized. Just be there, as her grandmother, to sing happy birthday and watch her blow out her candles. Melissa said she'd let me know. She let me know the morning of, via text. She said the party was really just close family and the girls from Rosie's class, and that it might be a lot of stimulation for me. I was 63 years old and in excellent health, but apparently a 7-year-old's birthday party was going to be too much stimulation for me. I baked the cake anyway. I don't entirely know why. Maybe I needed to do something with my hands, or maybe I just wasn't ready to admit how final things had gotten. I drove to their house. I knocked on the door. Melissa answered. Joel was right behind her. And that's when she said it. You make everything about yourself, Connie. I set the cake down on the kitchen counter. I looked at my son. He looked at the floor. I said, Happy birthday to Rosie. Please give her my love. And I walked back to my car. I went home and I did not fall apart immediately, which surprised me. I made tea. I sat in Harold's armchair. I looked at Rosie's drawing in the kitchen and I thought about what Harold would have said. Harold was a quiet man, but when he finally spoke, people listened. He used to say, Connie, the loudest thing you can do sometimes is nothing. He was right. He was almost always right. I waited a week, and then I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my attorney to review the trust documents one more time. The second was to a family therapist to schedule a session for myself because I wasn't going to get through this by just being angry, and I knew it. The third was to my daughter Bet in Portland. Bet answered on the second ring. I told her everything. I didn't soften it or edit it or make Melissa sound more complicated than she was being. I just told the truth. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Bet said, very quietly, Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't have a good answer for that. The week after that, Joel called. He said Melissa had found out that her request for trust information had been declined and that additional protections had been added. She was upset. He said it in that flattened tone he'd been using with me for months, the one that wasn't quite his real voice, the one that sounded like he was reading from a script someone else had written. I said, I know. He said, Mom, I think you're being Joel. I kept my voice quiet and even. Those funds are for Rosie and June, your daughters. Not for the mortgage on the new house, not for private school tuition to free up cash flow, not for anything except what I set them up for. That is not going to change. If Melissa has concerns about that, she's welcome to have her attorneys speak with mine. Silence. I said, I love you. I love your daughters. I am not angry, but I am also not going to let this go. He said, I need some time. I said, take all the time you need. And I meant it. For 2 months, the silence was almost total. No calendar invites, no texts. One brief call from Joel on my birthday, during which he said, Happy birthday, Mom. And I said, Thank you, sweetheart. And neither of us mentioned anything else. I won't pretend those 2 months were easy. They were some of the hardest of my life. And I've had hard months. I've buried a husband and sat in hospital waiting rooms and driven through the night to get to people I love. This was a different kind of hard. It was quiet and daily, and it lived in the small things. Setting the table for one, buying one bunch of bananas instead of 2, hearing a song on the radio that Rosie liked and having no one to text about it. But I also had more than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. Bet called every few days. My neighbor and longtime friend, Charlene, brought food twice and never once tried to give me advice, which was the most loving thing anyone could have done. My therapist helped me untangle the difference between things I could control and things I couldn't, and slowly, very slowly, I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head at 2 in the morning. I went to the farmer's market on Saturdays. I planted new things in Harold's vegetable garden. I finished a quilt I'd started 3 years before and never completed. I was still here, I was still myself, and I was still the trustee record holder for two education funds that would be waiting for my granddaughters on their 18th birthdays, no matter what else happened. The call came on a Sunday in October, late afternoon light just starting to turn golden, the kind of October light that makes North Carolina look like a painting. It was Joel. He didn't lead with pleasantries. He said, "Mom, can I come over?" He arrived an hour later. He looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. He sat down at the kitchen table. Same table. Always this same table. And he told me that he and Melissa had been to couples counseling 3 times, and that the therapist had said some things that had been difficult to hear. I didn't ask what things. I just waited. He said, "She told me I had been letting things happen that I shouldn't have let happen, and that the people who are getting hurt by it weren't just you." I thought about Rosie and June, about what they had absorbed, growing up in a house where Grandma Connie was kept at arm's length, about the lessons they were learning without knowing they were being taught. I said, "How are the girls?" He said, "Rosie asks about you. She asks why you haven't been coming on Sundays." I closed my eyes for a second. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I'm sorry I stood there in the kitchen that morning and let her say that to you, and I didn't." His voice cracked. I didn't do anything. I got up and I put my hand on his shoulder. He was crying, my 36-year-old son, and I stood there with my hand on his shoulder the way I had when he was 7 and 10 and 15, and every other age he'd needed me. I said, "I know." He said, "I don't know if things can be fixed." I said, "Some things can be. Let's start with the ones that can." I won't tell you everything is perfect now. It isn't. Melissa and I are not friends. We are probably not going to be. She is working on things in her own counseling, and I respect that, and I keep that respect at exactly the distance that feels honest rather than performed. But I see my granddaughters on Sundays again. Real Sundays. Not calendar invites. Not 2 hours in a scheduled window. I pick them up sometimes and bring them here. June sits at Harold's old desk in the study and draws pictures. Rosie helps me in the garden and asks me questions about everything. Why do tomatoes turn red? What did Grandpa Harold look like? What's my favorite song? Can I teach her to bake? Yes, I told her. Yes, I can teach you to bake. Last Sunday, she helped me make biscuits. She was absolutely covered in flour by the end. She thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened to her. The education funds are still in place. Rosie will be able to use hers in 11 years. June in 14. The money will be there, growing, waiting, the way Harold's careful love has been waiting in everything he left behind. In the paid-off house, and the vegetable garden, and the life insurance check that became something real and lasting for the two small people who carry his eyes. Nobody has tried to access those funds again. I'm not naive. I don't know what the next years will bring, or how Joel and Melissa's marriage will hold, or what shape our family will have on the other side of all of this. I've lived long enough to know that families don't resolve, they continue. They keep going. The work is always ongoing. But I know this. I sat in my car in my driveway on the day of Rosie's birthday and I thought I had lost everything. I thought the price of being a grandmother who loved her grandchildren was going to be silence and distance and watching from the outside for the rest of my life. I was wrong. Not because I won. I don't think in those terms anymore. But because I held on to what mattered. The girls, my son, myself, and I did not let go. And I did not pretend the hurt wasn't happening, and I did not stop being exactly who I am. Harold used to say that the deepest kind of love isn't the kind that makes noise, it's the kind that stays. I stayed. If you're a grandmother watching this and something in this story sounds familiar, if you've been managed and scheduled and made to feel like a guest in your own family, I want you to know you're not alone. And I want you to know they're not alone. And I want you to know that holding your ground doesn't have to mean burning anything down. Sometimes it just means standing in your own kitchen, knowing your own worth, and waiting for the people who love you to find their way back. They don't always, but sometimes they do. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from today. I read every single one. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in some abstract philosophical way, just in the plain practical way that life eventually teaches you if you're paying attention. Melissa didn't become who she was in a vacuum. And I didn't end up standing alone in that kitchen holding a birthday cake nobody wanted by accident either. Things build. Slowly, quietly, one small concession at a time. I said yes to the calendar invites. I wore the name tag at the birthday party. I swallowed words that needed to be spoken. And every time I did that, I was teaching everyone around me, including myself, that this was acceptable, that I could be managed, that my love was available without conditions and therefore without value. That's not Melissa's fault entirely. That's mine. I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because I think the most useful thing I can pass on to anyone watching is this. The choices we make when we're trying to keep the peace are still choices, and they have consequences just like every other kind. What I've learned, really learned in my bones, is that integrity isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you practice or don't. Every time I smiled through something that hurt me, I was practicing a kind of self-erasure. And every time I finally held my ground, when I told Joel I am not a bank, when I called my attorney, when I walked away from that kitchen without raising my voice, I was practicing something else, something harder and more honest. The education funds I set up for Rosie and June are still there. That was an act of intelligence, I think. Not cleverness, but the deeper kind of intelligence that asks, what will actually matter in 20 years? Not my feelings in the moment, not Melissa's approval, not even Joel's comfort. What will matter is whether those two little girls have options when they're grown. That's what I was protecting. And no amount of pressure or silence or screaming phone calls changed that, because I had been clear from the beginning about what it was for. That clarity, knowing exactly what you're doing and why, is its own kind of armor. And then there's the part about resilience, which I think gets misunderstood. People talk about resilience like it means not breaking, but I did break a little. I sat in my car and I cried. I ate dinner alone for 2 months. I lay awake at 2 in the morning rehearsing conversations that never happened. Resilience wasn't the absence of any of that. It was getting up the next morning anyway, planting things in Harold's garden, finishing the quilt, showing up for myself when no one else was going to. Joel found his way back. I believe he would have eventually regardless, because at his core he is a decent man who loves his mother. I raised him, I know what's in there. But I also think he came back faster because I didn't chase him, because I held my ground and he had to reckon with what that meant. That's the cause and effect I keep coming back to. Not punishment, not revenge, just the natural consequence of someone finally meaning what they say. If you're in something like this right now, if you're being slowly pushed to the edge of your own family, I just want you to remember that how you treat yourself teaches everyone else how to treat you. You don't have to be loud about it. You don't have to burn anything down, but you do have to mean it. I'm living proof that you can hold on to your dignity and your people at the same time. It's not easy, but it's possible.